Have you ever imagined being alone in the middle of the night, in an isolated parking lot, when a frenzied bark shatters the silence? But it's not a dog. It's a man, with wild eyes and foam at the mouth, banging on your truck's window. What would you do? My experience that night made me question my sanity. The road has always been my home, my refuge, and sometimes my worst nightmare. I'm 42 years old and I've been a trucker for over 2 decades. That night I was on a route I knew like the back of my hand, a meet-and-turn shift that took me from southern Illinois to the Kentucky border. The dashboard clock read 2:15 a.m. when I reached the meeting point, an isolated parking lot beside Interstate 57. It was a place known among us truckers, but that didn't make it any less eerie in the early hours of the morning. I turned off the engine and leaned back in the seat, feeling the weight of exhaustion from hours of driving. I looked around, taking in the darkness that swallowed everything beyond the reach of the few streetlights. The wet asphalt reflected the yellowish glow, creating pools of light on the ground. There was no other truck in sight, which meant I would have to wait at least an hour for my colleague to arrive for the swap. I decided to make use of the time to rest a bit. After all, we truckers learn to value every minute of sleep we can get. I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the night envelop me. The only sound was the occasional hum of a car passing by on the distant interstate. Little did I know that this night would become one of the most disturbing trucker horror stories I would ever experience. An event that would make me question not only my safety on the road, but also the boundaries of human sanity. As I began to drift into a light sleep, something was about to turn this routine stop into a trucker's nightmare that I would never forget. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I was abruptly ripped from my slumber by a disturbing sound. At first, I thought it was just part of a confusing dream, but as my consciousness returned, I realized it was real and getting louder. It was a bark, but not like that of an ordinary dog. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about that sound. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just some lost animal nearby. But the barking persisted, growing more intense and closer by the second. My heart began to race. Years on the road had taught me to trust my instincts, and at that moment, every fiber of my being screamed that something was not right. Slowly, I opened my eyes and forced myself to look out the truck window. What I saw froze me with fear. Just inches from the glass, illuminated by the faint light of the street lamp, stood a man. Not an ordinary man, but a figure that seemed to have stepped straight out of my worst nightmares. He was large, probably in his 30s, with eyes wide open that reflected a pure and terrifying madness. And he was barking like a rabid dog, foam dripping from the corners of his mouth. I remained still, barely daring to breathe. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was as if all the scary trucker stories I'd ever heard had materialized at once before my eyes. I knew I had to act, but fear paralyzed me. The dog man continued his relentless barking, his eyes fixed on me as if he could see straight into my soul. My survival instinct finally overcame my state of shock. With slow and deliberate movements, keeping my eyes locked on the terrifying figure outside, I reached for the ignition. My fingers trembled so much that I almost dropped the keys. The dog man noticed my movement. His barking intensified, becoming more frenzied and threatening. He started banging on the glass with his hands, leaving marks of saliva and sweat. The sound reverberated through the cab, mixing with the rapid beats of my heart. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. The noise seemed to enrage the creature even more. He stepped back for a moment, only to return with even more fury, punching and scratching at the truck door. I engaged the gear and floored the accelerator, the wheels spinning on the wet asphalt before finding traction. The truck moved forward, but the man didn't give up. He ran alongside the vehicle, still barking and trying to grasp the door. His wild eyes shone in the rearview mirror, a vision I know will haunt me for years. It was as if I were living one of those exaggerated road horror stories I'd always heard. I pressed the accelerator harder, the truck's engine protesting against the sudden strain. Gradually, the figure diminished in the mirror until it finally disappeared into the darkness. But I dared not slow down. I drove for miles, my whole body shaking, before finally stopping at a well-lit and busy gas station. The fluorescent lights of the gas station had never felt so comforting. I parked my truck near the convenience store, my eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of that disturbing figure. My hands were still trembling as I picked up my cell phone. I dialed the dispatch number, my voice shaking as I reported the incident. The dispatcher, accustomed to road stories, fell silent for a moment before instructing me to stay put and wait for the local police. As I waited, I watched the sky begin to lighten on the horizon, bringing a relief I didn't know I needed so desperately. 2 police officers arrived shortly after. They listened to my account with serious expressions, occasionally exchanging glances between themselves. The older one sighed deeply before speaking. "Sir, you're not the first to report something like this in this area. We've been having issues with a local individual, an ex-veteran, serious mental problems. He sometimes wanders onto the road at night." The reality of what had happened began to sink in. It wasn't a supernatural entity or a fatigue-induced hallucination. It was a real man, deeply disturbed, wandering the dark roads. Somehow, that made it all the more terrifying. The officers assured me that they would increase patrols in the area and advised me to avoid solitary stops for a while. As they walked away, I stood there, watching the sun rise, reflecting on how reality can be more horrifying than any ghost story. That night would become one of the most disturbing trucker horror stories I'd ever experienced, a constant reminder of the real dangers lurking in the shadows of America's highways. Imagine yourself driving alone on a stormy night, in the middle of nowhere, when suddenly, everything goes dark. I was at a deserted truck stop in Kansas when a sinister blue light appeared in the sky, casting bizarre shadows all around me. I felt my heart race and a chilling sensation running down my spine. Do you believe in horror stories? Wait until you hear this one. Want to know what happened next? Keep watching, because this experience will keep you up at night. I'm a 55-year-old trucker with over 2 decades of experience on American roads. I work for Transcontinental Logistics, a transportation company based in Omaha, Nebraska. On that fateful night, I was making a routine delivery from Chicago to Denver, crossing the heart of Kansas on I-70. The dashboard clock showed 10:37 p.m. when I noticed the first raindrops hitting the windshield. It wasn't unusual to encounter storms in this region, but something in the air made me uneasy. The radio crackled with static, and the dark sky seemed to swallow the light from my Peterbilt 579's headlights. As I progressed along the deserted highway, the rain quickly intensified. Within minutes, it turned into a fierce downpour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and visibility dropped drastically. I knew it was getting too dangerous to continue. That's when I spotted the lights of a rest area ahead. I sighed in relief, knowing I could wait out the storm safely. I carefully maneuvered the truck into the almost empty parking lot and turned off the engine with a tired sigh. Seated in the cab, I watched the rain batter the asphalt. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and occasional lightning flashes illuminated the black sky. Little did I know that this forced stop would be the beginning of one of the most disturbing experiences of my life as a trucker. The storm raged outside, turning the night into a chaos of wind and water. I was settled in the cab of my truck, trying to relax while waiting for the storm to pass. That's when everything changed in an instant. A blinding flash lit up the sky, followed by a deafening thunderclap that made the truck tremble. At the same moment, the rest area lights flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. My heart raced, and I felt a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness, I noticed something strange. An intense, unnatural blue light began to move slowly behind the heavy clouds. It was too big and slow to be an airplane, but too fast to be part of the storm. My mind searched for a rational explanation but came up empty. The mysterious light continued its path, passing over the hills and distant trees. As it drew closer, the blue glow intensified, casting strange shadows across the parking lot. I wondered if other truckers were seeing the same thing, if this was some kind of rare meteorological phenomenon or something more. For about 10 minutes I sat paralyzed, watching this supernatural light cross the sky above me. The glow was so bright that it illuminated the entire parking lot as if it were daytime. My mind wandered through all the trucker horror stories I'd ever heard, but none of them compared to what I was witnessing. When the light finally disappeared behind the rest area, I realized I had been holding my breath for quite some time. As soon as the mysterious light vanished, I sat in silence, my heart still pounding. The minutes ticked by slowly as I tried to process what I had just experienced. The trucker horror stories I used to hear at rest stops seemed like child's play compared to my real-life encounter. Suddenly, as if someone had flipped a giant switch, the rain stopped completely. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the storm itself. Seconds later, the parking lot lights flickered back to life, blinking a few times before stabilizing. I looked around, trying to spot any other truckers nearby, any witnesses who could confirm what I had seen. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few trucks parked far from mine. There was no sign of movement or anyone else who had noticed anything out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Part of me wanted to run away from that place, to continue my journey and leave this disturbing experience behind. But another part, perhaps the more sensible one, knew that I needed to rest before hitting the road again. After all, driving exhausted and scared could be just as dangerous as any supernatural phenomenon. I decided to stay for another hour, trying to compose myself. I turned on the radio, now working normally, and tuned into a country music station to ward off the oppressive silence. As the familiar notes filled the cab, I couldn't stop glancing at the sky through the windshield, half expecting to see that blue light return. After a tense hour, I decided it was time to get back on the road. The sky had brightened, revealing a carpet of bright stars, a surreal contrast to the chaos I had witnessed earlier. With my hands still trembling, I started the engine of my Peterbilt. I slowly drove out of the parking lot, my eyes alternating between the road ahead and the rearview mirrors. Part of me feared seeing some sort of spaceship or strange creature emerging from the darkness, but the I-70 was quiet and empty, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As I drove, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. I knew that this experience would join the ranks of trucker horror stories shared among us road warriors. But unlike many of those stories, I was certain of what I had witnessed. It wasn't a fatigue-induced hallucination or a trick of the light. It was something real and unexplainable. The miles passed, and gradually I began to calm down. The familiar rhythm of the road under the truck's wheels brought a sense of normalcy. Still, I knew that this night had changed something within me. The long, solitary journeys I once enjoyed now carried a new weight of apprehension and expectation. When the sun finally rose on the horizon, illuminating the Kansas plains, I felt a deep relief. I had survived one of the most disturbing nights of my career as a trucker. As I continued toward Denver, I made a promise to myself to be more cautious during nighttime drives from then on. After all, one never knows what might be lurking in the shadows of the road, ready to turn an ordinary trip into a real-life nightmare. Have you ever heard of the shoulder walkers? Imagine driving alone on Interstate 5 in the middle of the night, when suddenly, an elderly lady with a disturbing smile appears out of thin air. And she's not alone. I've been a trucker for 30 years, and what I encountered on that highway still haunts me to this day. If you think you've seen it all on the roads, think again. Keep watching and discover what truly lurks in the shadows. It was just another night in my life as a trucker. I'm 65 years old, and for over 30 years I've been crisscrossing the country's highways hauling cargo. On that particular night, I was on my usual route from Vancouver to San Francisco, a trip I know like the back of my hand. The clock struck 1:15 a.m. as I entered Interstate 5, leaving the lights of Portland behind. Darkness swallowed the road ahead, broken only by the headlights of my truck. The radio played softly, more for company than for entertainment. I enjoy driving at night. There's less traffic, and the feeling of solitude on the road has its own charm. Of course, I've seen my fair share of strange things on these nighttime trips. Unexplained lights in the sky, animals appearing out of nowhere, and even people doing bizarre things by the roadside. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I was traversing a particularly deserted stretch of the highway, miles away from any town or gas station. That's when I saw her for the first time. An elderly lady wearing a blue summer dress, walking calmly along the shoulder of the road. I found it odd but not impossible. Maybe she was a hippie who had camped nearby. but she was just the first. Over the following months, I started noticing more of them. Other truckers call them moonwalkers, but I prefer to call them shoulder walkers. Always at night, always alone, always walking. Men, women, young, old, all types. And they always gave me a strange feeling, as if something wasn't quite right. Months passed since I first noticed the shoulder walkers. Although their presence always made me slightly uncomfortable, I had grown accustomed to occasionally spotting them during my nighttime drives, until that fateful night. It was a routine run. Once again on Interstate 5, the sky was unusually dark, with no moon or stars visible. My headlights sliced through the darkness like knives, revealing only a few meters of asphalt ahead. That's when I saw her. An elderly lady wearing a hospital gown was slowly walking along the shoulder of the road. Her white curly hair contrasted with her pale, almost translucent skin. Her eyes were sunken, but a disturbing smile played on her thin lips. Something about her made me stop. Maybe it was the resemblance to my late grandmother, or perhaps it was the sheer inappropriateness of her presence in that desolate place. I quickly checked my GPS. The nearest town was over 50 miles away. How could she have gotten there? Against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The sound of her shuffling footsteps echoed in the silent night. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just kept approaching with that fixed smile. When she came close enough for the beam of my flashlight to illuminate her fully, a chill ran down my spine. There was something deeply wrong with her. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and her wrinkled hands reached out toward me. My body froze in fear. In a surprisingly swift move for someone who looked so fragile, she grabbed my ankles with superhuman strength. Panic took over me. I struggled desperately to break free, kicking and flailing. Finally, I managed to land a kick on her chin. To my horror, it felt like kicking solid concrete. But miraculously, she let go. I scrambled away from her, my heart pounding. She simply resumed her walk, as if nothing had happened. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on me as she faded into the darkness. I stood frozen on the cold asphalt for long minutes, trying to process what had just occurred. My ragged breathing was the only sound breaking the sepulchral silence of the night. Finally, I gathered the courage to get back into the truck, my legs trembling with every step. I sat in the cab, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, filled with unanswered questions. What was that thing? How could it have such strength? And why was it there, in the middle of nowhere? I started the engine, determined to get away from that place as quickly as possible. It didn't take long for me to catch up with her again. There she was, walking along the shoulder as if nothing had happened. Her hollow eyes fixed on me as I passed by, and that sinister smile still played on her parched lips. I stepped on the accelerator, eager to put as much distance as I could between us. But the relief I expected to feel never came. Instead, a sense of dread started settling in my chest. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. Every shadow on the road made me jump. Every distant figure made my heart race. And then, I started noticing a disturbing change. The shoulder walkers, who had previously seemed to ignore my presence, now always looked directly at me when I passed by. Their empty stares followed me, and their enigmatic smiles haunted me. It was as if my encounter with that elderly lady had marked me somehow, making me visible to them. I began avoiding nighttime routes whenever possible. When it was unavoidable to drive at night, my eyes constantly scanned the shoulder, dreading what I might see. Fear had become my constant companion on the road. I spoke to other truckers, seeking comfort or explanations. To my surprise and horror, I discovered that I was the first one to attempt interacting with one of these beings. Others had always instinctively avoided them. My experience quickly spread among the trucker community, becoming one of the most disturbing trucker horror stories. A significant amount of time has passed since that fateful encounter, but the consequences still haunt me. Each nighttime trip has become a test of nerves, with my eyes constantly alert for any movement on the shoulder. The trucker horror stories that once made me laugh now seem like ominous premonitions. On a particularly dark night, as I was driving through an isolated stretch of the highway, I saw something that chilled my blood. A child, no older than 8, was walking alone along the shoulder. The vacant stare and forced smile were identical to those of the other shoulder walkers I had encountered. My first instinct was to stop and help, but the memory of the elderly lady held me back. With a heavy heart, I drove past, watching in the rearview mirror as the diminutive figure faded into the darkness. Guilt gnawed at me for days, mixing with the fear that had already become my constant companion. It was at that moment that I realized I had to do something. I couldn't keep this experience to myself. What if another trucker, unaware of the danger, stopped to help one of these beings? The thought terrified me. I decided to share my story. I started telling other truckers at rest stops, spreading the warning about the dangers of the shoulder walkers. Many laughed it off as just another road horror story. Others listened intently, their eyes widening at the more disturbing details. My story quickly spread, becoming one of the most talked about trucker horror stories at truck stops. Some started calling it the shoulder nightmare, others the curse of the nocturnal walker. The name didn't matter as long as the message got across. Today, I'm still on the roads, facing my fears on every nighttime trip. The shoulder walkers are still out there, their hollow eyes always fixed on me as I pass by. But now I know I'm not alone in this silent struggle against the unknown. To all the truckers who will read this, and to anyone venturing onto the dark highways of the night, I leave this warning. If you see someone walking alone on the shoulder of a deserted stretch of road, do not stop. No matter how harmless they may seem, no matter how much you want to help, keep driving. For in the shadows of the night, not everything is what it seems. And remember, the haunted highways of truckers hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. Stay safe, stay alert, and above all, keep moving. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.